You are standing in the royal palace of Madrid on a bitter November morning in 1700, watching the court physician perform an autopsy on the most powerful man in Europe. King Charles II of Spain lies before you, his grotesquely deformed body finally still after 39 years of constant suffering. The doctor's hands shake as he cuts open the chest cavity, but nothing could have prepared him for what he finds inside. His heart, the physician dictates to his trembling scribe, is the size of a peppercorn. His lungs are corroded and putrid. His intestines are rotten and gangrenous, but the horror is only beginning. His body, the doctor continues with growing disbelief, contains not a single drop of blood. His head is full of water, and he has only one testicle, black as coal. This is not the corpse of a diseased peasant or a plague victim. This is the king of the Spanish Empire, ruler of territories spanning 4 continents, heir to the most powerful dynasty in European history. The man whose death will trigger the bloodiest war of the 18th century, killing over 1 million people in the struggle for his throne. Charles II was not the victim of disease or accident. He was the final, horrifying product of a systematic genetic experiment that the Habsburg family had conducted on themselves for over 2 centuries. His monstrously malformed body was the inevitable result of a royal obsession with bloodline purity so extreme that it transformed one of history's most successful dynasties into a laboratory of human genetic destruction. The Spanish Habsburgs had not stumbled into inbreeding by accident. They had pursued it with the calculating precision of scientists conducting an experiment, except their laboratory was the human genome, and their test subjects were their own children. By the time of Charles II's birth in 1661, the Habsburg family tree had ceased to branch. It had become a twisted knot that strangled itself, with uncle-niece marriages so common that over 80% of all Habsburg unions were between blood relatives. Charles II's own parents were uncle and niece, but the genetic damage ran so deep that modern scientists have calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, meaning he was more genetically compromised than the typical child of brother and sister. His body was a living monument to the horror of treating human beings as breeding stock, and his reign would bring down an empire that had once declared the sun never set on its lands. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The nightmare began long before Charles II's birth. In the early 1500s, when the Habsburg family achieved something unprecedented in European history, they became too successful for their own good. Through strategic marriages, military conquest, and political maneuvering, they controlled vast territories from Austria to Spain to the Netherlands. Their empire was so enormous that they famously boasted the sun never set on Habsburg lands. But this success created a problem that would ultimately destroy them. The Habsburgs became convinced that their remarkable achievements were the result of superior genetics, divine bloodlines that set them apart from ordinary mortals. The family developed an ideology that bordered on religious fanaticism about genetic purity. They believed that marrying outside their immediate family would contaminate their sacred blood, diluting the special qualities that made them fit to rule. This was not simply political strategy. It was a fundamental belief system that viewed their DNA as literally blessed by God. The Spanish court developed elaborate theories about bloodline purity that portrayed inbreeding not as a dangerous practice, but as a sacred duty to preserve divine inheritance. The Catholic Church played a crucial enabling role in this systematic genetic destruction. While canon law technically prohibited marriages between close relatives, the Church routinely granted dispensations for Habsburg unions that would have been forbidden for ordinary people. These dispensations were not issued reluctantly. They were celebrated as recognition of the special status of Habsburg blood. Pope after pope blessed uncle-niece marriages, cousin unions, and other consanguineous relationships that the Church would have condemned as sinful among common people. The creation of Charles II was the inevitable outcome of this systematic approach to human breeding. His father, Philip IV of Spain, married his own niece, Mariana of Austria, in 1649. But the genetic damage extended far beyond this single union. When scientists finally analyzed Charles's family tree in the 21st century, they discovered that all of his great-grandparents descended from the same couple, Philip I and Joanna of Castile. The family had been systematically destroying its own genetic diversity for generations, creating a genetic bottleneck so severe that Charles carried identical copies of genes inherited from common ancestors in over a quarter of his genome. Charles II's entrance into the world on November 6, 1661, was met not with joy, but with horror that court officials struggled to conceal. The future king emerged bearing the unmistakable signs of genetic catastrophe that would define every moment of his tortured existence. His head was grotesquely oversized, his jaw protruded at an unnatural angle, and his tiny body showed clear signs of developmental abnormalities that left physicians baffled and terrified. The royal doctors found themselves confronting medical challenges they had never encountered, treating a patient whose very existence defied their understanding of human biology. The infant's skull was malformed in ways that suggested severe brain development issues. His breathing was labored from birth, indicating respiratory problems that would plague him throughout his life. Most disturbing of all, his reproductive organs showed signs of the same developmental failures that affected the rest of his body. Contemporary medical records describe an infant whose sex could not be immediately determined, whose genitals were so malformed that physicians debated whether he was male or female or something else entirely. As Charles grew from infant to child, the full extent of his genetic damage became increasingly apparent and impossible to conceal. He did not speak his first coherent words until he was 4 years old, and even then his speech was barely comprehensible due to his malformed jaw and swollen tongue. The famous Habsburg jaw was so pronounced in Charles that he could not close his mouth properly, causing him to drool constantly and creating puddles on the marble floors that servants had to clean throughout the day. Walking proved even more challenging than speech. Charles's legs were so weak and deformed that he could not support his own body weight until he was 8 years old. Even then, his gait was unsteady and painful, requiring constant assistance from court attendants who had to catch him when he fell multiple times each day. His spine curved unnaturally, creating a hunched posture that caused chronic pain no medical treatment could relieve. Court records describe a child who moved like an elderly man, his body aged and broken before he reached adolescence. The seizures that would torment Charles throughout his life began in early childhood and only grew worse with time. These were not mild episodes that could be discreetly managed during court functions. They were violent convulsions that would strike without warning, leaving the young prince unconscious and surrounded by frightened courtiers. During these attacks, Charles would foam at the mouth, his eyes would roll back, and his body would shake so violently that witnesses feared he might die on the spot. The seizures were so severe that palace staff learned to recognize the warning signs and clear the area before Charles collapsed. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Charles's condition was his retained cognitive function. Despite his severe physical disabilities, he possessed enough mental capacity to understand that he was different from other people. Court observers noted that he would sometimes stare at paintings of his ancestors, seemingly trying to understand why he looked so different from the strong, healthy kings who had ruled before him. He could comprehend the disgust in people's faces when they looked at him, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, and the constant whispered speculation about his ability to rule. The daily routine of caring for Charles required an army of servants and medical professionals who found themselves managing not just a monarch, but a patient whose needs exceeded those of any hospital ward. He needed help with the most basic functions: eating, drinking, walking, even sitting upright for extended periods. His food had to be pureed because his jaw could not handle solid substances, and even then he frequently choked or vomited due to his swallowing difficulties. Multiple servants were assigned to clean up after him throughout the day, as he frequently lost control of bodily functions during seizures. The psychological impact on the Spanish court was devastating. Nobles who had dreamed of advancement through royal favor found themselves instead serving as caregivers to a monarch who required constant medical supervision. The grand ceremonies of Spanish court life had to be modified to accommodate a king who might collapse without warning or require immediate medical attention during important diplomatic meetings. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in shocked amazement about what they witnessed. Hardened diplomats who had survived battlefield casualties and plague outbreaks, but were unprepared for the sight of Europe's most powerful monarch struggling to perform basic human functions. Charles II's reproductive incapacity became the most politically devastating aspect of his genetic condition. Despite 2 marriages, he never produced an heir, and contemporary observers understood why. His autopsy revealed that he possessed only 1 testicle, which had atrophied to the point of uselessness. British envoy Alexander Stanhope reported that Charles had a ravenous stomach, but swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet. The king's inability to chew food properly led to chronic digestive problems that left him malnourished despite constant eating. The systematic inbreeding that created Charles II was not limited to his immediate family, but represented a pattern that had infected the entire Habsburg dynasty for generations. Modern genetic analysis reveals that between 1516 and 1700, over 80% of marriages within the Spanish Habsburg dynasty were consanguineous, unions between blood relatives that would be considered incestuous by modern standards. These marriages included uncle-niece unions, first-cousin relationships, and even more complex arrangements where partners were related through multiple lines of descent. The family's obsession with genetic purity had created a feedback loop of destruction. Each generation of damaged Habsburg children provided justification for even more extreme measures to preserve bloodline purity. The worse the genetic problems became, the more convinced the family grew that they needed to avoid contamination from outside bloodlines. They could not acknowledge that their inbreeding practices were causing the problems without admitting that their fundamental ideology was wrong. Other European families were not immune to the Habsburg genetic experiment. Charles's sister, Margaret Theresa of Spain, was married to her own uncle, Leopold I of Austria, in 1666. The marriage was politically motivated but genetically catastrophic. Margaret Theresa died at age 21. Her body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of Habsburg inheritance. Her death was mourned throughout the empire, but not for the right reasons. Courtiers lamented the loss of potential heirs rather than the tragedy of a young woman whose life had been sacrificed to preserve a bloodline that was already poisoned beyond redemption. The international community's response to Habsburg practices reveals how systematic abuse can be normalized when it serves political interests. Other European powers, who should have been horrified by Habsburg inbreeding, instead found it useful for their own purposes. A weakened Spanish monarchy meant reduced Habsburg influence, which benefited rival nations. French diplomats wrote detailed reports about Charles II's condition not out of concern for human suffering, but to assess Spanish military and political capabilities. The economic consequences of Habsburg inbreeding extended far beyond the royal family to affect the entire Spanish Empire. Charles II's inability to rule effectively allowed corruption to flourish throughout the government, military decay to weaken Spain's defenses, and economic mismanagement to bankrupt the treasury. The empire that had once dominated Europe was reduced to a second-rate power not through external conquest, but through internal genetic collapse. The Spanish people paid the ultimate price for their rulers' genetic obsessions. The court consumed enormous resources caring for Charles II's medical needs, while neglecting the basic infrastructure and economic development that could have sustained the empire. Peasants and urban workers faced increasing taxation to fund a monarchy that was literally dying from within, its royal bloodline so corrupted that it could no longer perform the basic biological function of reproduction. Charles II's final years were marked by increasing episodes of what can only be described as psychological disintegration. Court records describe incidents where he insisted on having the corpses of his deceased relatives exhumed so he could see them, behavior that terrified even his most devoted servants. His paranoia reached such extremes that he suspected everyone around him of plotting his death, accusations that were not entirely without merit given the political stakes involved in the succession crisis. The king's superstitious beliefs reflected the desperate search for explanations for his condition that went beyond genetic reality. He became convinced that his problems were the result of witchcraft, earning him the nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He submitted to countless exorcisms and spiritual treatments, believing that supernatural forces rather than natural ones were responsible for his suffering. The Spanish court became a grotesque theater of pseudoscientific remedies and religious rituals designed to cure problems that were embedded in Charles's very DNA. Charles II's death on November 1st, 1700, triggered the largest European conflict of the 18th century. The War of Spanish Succession lasted 13 years and killed over 1 million people, making it one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history. The war existed solely because the Habsburg genetic experiment had produced a king so damaged that he could not reproduce, leaving the vast Spanish Empire without a clear successor. The immediate aftermath of Charles's death revealed the full extent of damage that centuries of inbreeding had inflicted on Spanish society. Rather than mourning the passing of their monarch, European courts immediately began plotting to divide Spanish territories among themselves. The Habsburg genetic experiment had become such common knowledge that no foreign power believed Spain could continue as a major force under its traditional ruling family. The autopsy findings that so shocked the court physician were not merely medical curiosities, but evidence of systematic genetic destruction. Charles II's heart, reduced to the size of a peppercorn, could barely pump blood through his massive, waterlogged body. His lungs, corroded by years of respiratory infections, could not provide adequate oxygen to his brain. His intestines, rotten and gangrenous, could not process food properly despite his constant eating. His single, atrophied testicle represented the ultimate failure of the Habsburg genetic experiment, the inability to produce the next generation. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed what court physicians suspected for generations. Charles II was the inevitable outcome of systematic inbreeding that had reduced the Habsburg gene pool to a collection of damaged, recessive alleles. Scientists who studied his genealogy in the 21st century discovered that his level of inbreeding exceeded that typically seen in the offspring of siblings. His genome was so compromised that survival to adulthood represented a biological miracle. The Habsburg response to this catastrophe reveals the institutional blindness that had enabled the genetic experiment in the first place. Rather than acknowledging that their inbreeding practices had caused the crisis, surviving family members blamed external enemies, divine displeasure, and supernatural forces for their dynasty. The Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity had created a king so damaged that he could not fulfill the basic biological requirement of monarchy, producing an heir. The million people who died in the subsequent war were victims of a genetic experiment that had prioritized abstract ideological goals over human welfare. The parallels between Habsburg practices and modern genetic technologies are both fascinating and disturbing. While contemporary science offers genuine benefits through genetic screening and therapy, the Habsburg example serves as a warning about what happens when genetic ideology overrides humanitarian concerns. The same logic that led the Habsburgs to view human beings as breeding stock rather than individuals deserving of dignity continues to appear in different forms throughout modern society. Perhaps most relevantly, the Habsburg story demonstrates how institutions can perpetuate systematic harm through willful blindness and self-serving justifications. The family genuinely believed they were preserving something sacred through their marriage practices, yet their sincere convictions led to centuries of human suffering. This serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of any belief system that treats human beings as means to an end rather than individuals deserving of love and dignity. The role of enabling institutions in the Habsburg disaster cannot be overlooked. These patterns of institutional failure continue to manifest in contemporary contexts where powerful organizations prioritize their own interests over human welfare. The Habsburg genetic experiment also reveals how good intentions can mask systematic cruelty. The family's genuine belief in their divine right to rule and their sincere conviction that they were preserving something sacred through inbreeding does not diminish the horror of what they did to their own children. Charles II's suffering was real regardless of the ideological justifications that created it, and his pain serves as a permanent reminder that noble intentions cannot justify inhuman practices. The economic and social costs of the Habsburg experiment extended far beyond the royal family to affect millions of ordinary people throughout the Spanish Empire. The resources devoted to caring for genetically damaged monarchs could have been used to improve education, infrastructure, and economic development. Rather than creating superior human beings, they produced some of the most damaged individuals in recorded history. Their pursuit of genetic perfection led to genetic catastrophe on a scale that still challenges medical understanding. The international response to Charles II's death provides a sobering lesson about how quickly political realities can change when leadership fails. The Spanish Empire that had once dominated Europe became a prize to be divided among more competent powers within months of their last Habsburg ruler's death. The genetic experiment that was supposed to ensure eternal Habsburg dominance instead guaranteed their rapid extinction as a major political force. The scientific analysis of the Habsburg family tree in the 21st century has provided unprecedented insights into the mechanisms of genetic damage. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient of 0.254 represents one of the highest levels of consanguinity ever documented in human history, comparable to the offspring of parent and child. This level of genetic damage should have been incompatible with survival. Yet Charles somehow lived for nearly 40 years, a testament to both human resilience and the horror of systematic inbreeding. The Habsburg physicians who attempted to treat Charles II found themselves confronting medical challenges that exceeded their understanding of human biology. Their treatments, bloodletting, purging, and spiritual remedies, were not merely ineffective. His courtiers, required to pretend that his obvious incapacity was normal, participated in a collective delusion that prioritized political stability over human reality. The preservation of Charles II's reign for nearly 40 years, despite his obvious unfitness for rule, demonstrates the power of institutional momentum over rational decision-making. The Spanish court continued to function around a monarch who could barely function himself, creating elaborate protocols and ceremonies to accommodate his disabilities while maintaining the fiction of effective leadership. This institutional adaptation to dysfunction provides sobering lessons about how organizations can perpetuate harmful practices through collective denial. The Habsburg story also illuminates the role of secrecy in enabling systematic abuse. The full extent of Charles II's condition was hidden from the public and even from many court officials, creating an information vacuum that allowed the genetic experiment to continue unchallenged. The culture of secrecy that surrounded royal medical conditions prevented the kind of open discussion that might have led to recognition of the genetic damage being caused by inbreeding. The religious dimensions of the Habsburg genetic experiment reveal how spiritual beliefs can be manipulated to justify systematic cruelty. The family's conviction that their bloodline was divinely blessed provided theological justification for practices that caused immense human suffering. The Church's willingness to grant dispensations for incestuous marriages demonstrated how religious institutions can become complicit in systematic abuse when their interests align with those of political power. The Habsburg legacy in Spanish culture extended far beyond the royal family to influence attitudes toward marriage, inheritance, and social hierarchy throughout society. The emphasis on bloodline purity that destroyed the royal family also affected noble families who attempted to emulate Habsburg practices on a smaller scale. The cultural damage caused by the genetic experiment continued to influence Spanish society long after the dynasty's extinction. The medical mystery of Charles II's survival provides insights into human genetic resilience that continue to inform contemporary research. His ability to live for nearly 40 years despite carrying one of the highest inbreeding coefficients in recorded history suggests that human beings possess remarkable capacity to survive even extreme genetic damage. This resilience makes his suffering even more tragic, as it prolonged his agony while failing to provide the reproductive capacity necessary for dynastic continuation. The Habsburg genetic experiment represents one of history's most comprehensive examples of systematic dehumanization carried out with the best of intentions. The family's genuine belief in their divine mission to preserve royal bloodlines does not diminish the horror of what they did to their own children. Charles II's legacy serves as a permanent reminder that good intentions cannot justify practices that treat human beings as breeding stock rather than individuals deserving of dignity and choice. Return with me now to that palace chamber where we began, watching the court physician examine the corpse of Charles II of Spain. In that moment of medical horror, we witness more than just the death of one man. We see the final chapter of a dynasty that had spent centuries systematically destroying its own children in pursuit of an impossible ideal of genetic perfection. Charles II's twisted spine, malformed jaw, and waterlogged brain were not accidents of nature or acts of divine displeasure. They were the inevitable outcome of human choices made by people who convinced themselves that ideology mattered more than individual welfare. His ancestors had not stumbled into genetic disaster, but had pursued it with the calculating precision of an experiment, except their laboratory was the human genome, and their test subjects were their own descendants. The man who should have been the pinnacle of royal achievement instead became a living monument to the dangers of treating human beings as means to an end rather than individuals deserving of love and dignity. His inability to father children did not just end a dynasty. It triggered wars that killed millions and collapsed an empire that had dominated the known world. Charles II achieved a kind of immortality, but not the glorious legacy his ancestors had sought. His name survives as a warning about what happens when power becomes disconnected from humanity, when abstract goals override immediate human needs, and when institutions become so invested in their own ideology that they cannot see the suffering they create. The court physician's trembling hands, as he recorded those shocking autopsy findings, were not just documenting medical anomalies, but providing evidence of a crime against humanity that had been committed in the name of genetic purity. In the end, history's most inbred king left behind not a strengthened bloodline, but a shattered empire and a permanent reminder that true nobility lies not in genetic inheritance, but in the courage to value human dignity above all other considerations. His grotesque death marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the conclusion of one of history's most systematic attempts to engineer human genetics through institutional cruelty. The Habsburg genetic experiment had consumed itself completely, leaving only the echo of Charles II's suffering as a warning to future generations about the ultimate cost of treating human beings as breeding stock rather than individuals deserving of compassion and respect.